Namaste. My name is Amish Tripathi. I'm the director of the Nehru Centre. Um, for those of you who are not geology graduates, this term may sound new. Holocene. That is the geological epoch in which we live. Holocene began at the end of the last great ice age, so 11.5 to 12,000 years ago. But there are some geologists who say that actually perhaps Holocene as a name for our epoch has become old and a new epoch has begun, and some of them call it Anthropocene, literally the epoch of man, the age of man, because human beings themselves are now a force of nature. Human beings are impacting Mother Nature and the environment on a scale that was difficult to imagine for any living being to do. Geological forces, yes, but for a living being to become a force of nature is itself something that Mother Earth has never seen before, and therefore there's this thought of calling our epoch now Anthropocene. Now, some may get scared by the thought Anthropocene that we human beings are a force of nature and we are obviously hurting the environment drastically, especially over the last 100, years. But some may see it positively that look, this shows that we actually have the power to impact the environment positively as well. And this is the context in which we thought at the Nehru Centre that this would be a good book to discuss. Anthropocene by Sudeep Sen, a poet whose work I've enjoyed for many years. He's extremely passionate about the impact that human beings are having on the environment and what we can do to ameliorate the massive negative consequences that human beings are having on the environment. This is a tough time. This is a tough issue to pick up, not just for for leaders across the world, because it's very easy to demand from our leaders that they have to ensure that that the carbon footprint of human beings goes down. But are we as ordinary human beings willing to give up the massive lifestyle improvements we've had over the last 100 years? Because it's difficult to imagine the environment being put back on an even keel without us making those sacrifices. These are tough issues, and Sudeep discusses them beautifully in his new book through the poems that he puts up. Let me read out Sudeep's introduction before I call up his publisher, Mr. Prabhu Guptaraji, and then the program can continue. Sudeep Sen is the editorial director of Arc Arts and the editor of Atlas, and currently the inaugural artist in residence at the Museo Camera. Sen is the first Asian honored to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture and read at the Nobel Laureate Festival. The Government of India awarded him the Senior Fellowship for Outstanding Persons in the field of culture and literature. So these prize-winning books include Postmarked India, Rain, Arya, Anthropocene, which we'll be launching today, and many others. Now, if we may call up his publisher, Prabhu Guptaraji, up on stage.
Yes, thank you very much, Amishji, for kindly inviting me to speak. I just wanted to say that, when I started this little publishing imprint in memory of my wife, I had no idea that I'd be publishing Sudeep Sen. And the reason I did not have any idea about that was because I had no intention of publishing poetry. And the reason I had no intention of publishing poetry is because I'm a poet myself. And so, of course, my decisions and judgments would be prejudiced and biased. So I had no intention of publishing poetry at all. But, of course, it is our India's 75th anniversary of independence next year. And so as a publisher, I'm publishing a series of books to mark that. And so the idea came up, why not a collection of literature? But then literature is a big thing, literature has many different aspects. And so I thought it would not be a bad idea to have a collection of poetry, as our nation is such a highly poetic nation. You can go to any of our languages, we are full of poetry. You go to any of our religions, they're full of poetry. Yeah. So I thought it would be not inappropriate to have a collection of poems. And then I thought, who should edit it?
Our fundamental itself is a kavya, Adi Kavya, the Ramayana. We are poets of nature.
Correct. So I approached Sudeep, and Sudeep kindly agreed. So Sudeep will be editing or is editing the collection of poems that I'll be publishing next year. And then he said to me, he's got this collection of poems on the environment. And I thought, well, I'm not happy to publish, an individual poet as a poet, but because these are poems on the environment, which is such an important issue for all of us around the world, of course, particularly for us in India, because as a poor country, we are more exposed to the impact of any environmental disaster than rich countries can afford, to put up huge sea walls and whatever else they can do. We can't afford to do these things, so we are more vulnerable to these things. And I thought it was very appropriate to publish Sudeep's collection on the environment. That's why we have this lovely collection, beautifully produced and beautifully presented. And I must say this with no iota of pride on my own behalf in it, because it is actually designed by Sudeep, and it is actually, the production was actually overseen by Sudeep. So I had very, very little influence on the quality of what was produced. And it is such a beautifully produced book. So I'm very happy with it outside and in.
So not only is Sudeep, as someone calls the Ghalib of our age, he's also the Ogilvy of our age.
Indeed. And not a bad photographer to boot.
Well, let's have the program continue. I guess Sudeep and Indrani should be brought up, and I will take your leave. I'll leave the stage to you fine people.
Thank you.
Hello, greetings everyone. It's so lovely to see everyone here.
Hi, this is lovely to be here. It's back to Nehru Centre. I remember I was part of the very, very first program, the opening program of Nehru Centre. This was way back, I don't know how many decades ago, when Gopal Gandhi was the first director of the centre, and Kathleen Rain. So it was an august company of poets and philosophers. And I remember reading Blake. I was asked to read Blake, one of Kathleen Rain's big areas of expertise. And it's not inappropriate, the Blakean view of the world. We are talking about the world, the environment. So it's lovely to be back at the Nehru Centre, albeit sitting in Delhi in my study.
That's right. Well, I am in London. I'm only a stone's throw away from Nehru Centre, an old friend of mine. My connection with the Nehru Centre goes back to the days of Monica Kapil Mehta, and it continues. The friendship now simply grows deeper and connected in more ways than simply being a classical dance artist. So today, it's a very great honor, actually, to have the interviewer hat on and to be in conversation with Prabhuji and you, Sudipta, on this amazing piece of work, great new work, really, really groundbreaking. So a hearty greetings to all our friends of the Nehru Centre and joining us from across the globe. Personally, for me, as a legal professional, performer and cultural curator, Anthropocene speaks to me on many levels. Corporate cultures, of course, are changing slowly in their aims to zero businesses, and the UK regulatory framework is also changing. And everyone is now trying to understand this balance of sustainability on one hand and the much needed economic gains on the other hand. How to caretake our environment and the shape of the legacy that we leave behind has been a tricky question and issue for many years, despite its very elemental connection to our lives. And frankly, no matter what we do, the world has already started its transformation. And this is where Anthropocene hits home. So it is a first of its type, a full-length book by a poet, creative writer, Sudipta, dedicated to urgent issues of climate change and pandemic. I wanted to just read out a couple of things that experts who are wordsmiths, great wordsmiths, Mala Shri Lal of news magazine Outlook describes Anthropocene as simultaneously brilliant, disturbing, and calming. A literary tour de force that will surely be among the most defining books about the global pandemic and climate change. Celebrated writer Amitav Ghosh hails it as an impassioned and heartfelt response to the intersecting planetary crisis of our time. it is of the utmost importance that more voices from the global south bear witness to the multiple catastrophes that are now unfolding around us. I mean, really, this is just a taster of what kind of reaction and response this new publication has elicited. So my first question to you, Sudeep, was there a pull, or did it just come as a conscious process of discovery, this Anthropocene that we see now?
Thank you very, very much. It's very, very generous of all of you. Thank you, Amish, for those lovely words. Prabhu as well for guiding the book through. Yes, I have to admit that I'm very, 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 very keen on the placement of word and how design is. So I sort of got into the act and made Prabhu's life so much easier. So so that's and the photography aspect of it too. And the reason I say that is I look at Anthropocene as a holistic way, just as I see writing, the other arts, photography, dance, as part of a larger cultural force. We can't do any of these things in isolation, just as in the world, none of the forces in nature are acting in isolation. So, of course, I've been thinking about climate change, not as an idea which is so beautifully summed up in one word, Anthropocene. But certainly climate change. And I remember way back, I was looking completely by chance, saw this news clip, and the president of this island nation of in the Pacific island nation, Kiribati, and this was a while ago. This is not even recently. This is 15 odd years ago. He was being interviewed by one of the news channels. I forget which one, but he was talking about, you're asking me, he was talking to the journalist. He says, you're asking me about economic policies and education and healthcare in my country, but really, I know in about 10 years' time, I don't know whether my people will have a home. That island of Kiribati is only 6 feet above the ocean level. And the way the ocean levels are rising, the entire country would be what is termed as climate refugees. So it's a shocking kind of thing to see that, a perfectly healthy nation in the Pacific where food is abundant and people are healthy, there's sunshine, there's, but in no fault of their own, they'll be nationless, homeless. So, once started thinking a lot about it, I started delving into it, and that's how it evolved. So it wasn't something that I planned on writing as such, but it was a slow evolution. Having said that, the pandemic and the lockdown didn't help. So we were, of course, locked down with all these crazy things happening, and India, of course, has been hit very, very badly. So in the lockdown, what does one do? I do more of what I used to do before, which is an existence in the lockdown, because I work in my study, and that's quarantine and isolation is something that I'm very used to, except that we can't travel. So I thought more, I wrote more, and I was writing about what was happening around me. And it had to be the pandemic and the climate change, because that was so viscerally in front of my eyes. So that's really how it happened. So I think it similarly, just as Amish says, the Holocene got accelerated to Anthropocene. So a book that might have taken longer got accelerated due to the pandemic and the lockdown.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, how can you not respond when you are in one of the epicenters of this new pandemic and all that it brings, the emotions, the colors, the human experiences, the spiritual calls? That really brings me to this idea of this connection and isolation. Such a juxtaposition of these human experiences that you yourself already have in your life. As a writer, it is something that you are already very, very familiar with, spending days on end in your own thoughts and in your own space. But let's look at it now when it's an isolation and that's put upon you, and it's and it's suddenly maybe bringing different textures, different colors. Even the sound of silence might be different now than it used to be, how you remember it, 15 months ago. Do you find that there's both a sense of comfort and discomfort in both the new way of connection that you've discovered and also this new texture of isolation?
Discomfort, yes, because we are used to older patterns. And when we have to recalibrate and get into new spaces, new ways of dealing with people, it is a source of learning. We have to adapt. And we are not used to, imagine just what we are doing right now. We would be at the Nehru Centre interacting in person, probably on stage. We would have had live video feeds and so on. But unfortunately, we are all at home locked down. But it's been a while, so we are getting used to what the Zooms and the StreamYards of the world. It's not ideal, but it's better than not meeting and not interacting. In many ways, it also has clarified a lot of things for me, because I'm able to cut out a lot of noise and activities which I was doing because that's what society was all about. And I realize now that I don't really need to do it. Just do what is required, what is essential. And for me, which is just try and be a good neighbor, a good human being, help a few people in the world as you can. We can't help everybody. Think right and not waste time, really, in a sense, because too many other things were consuming our lives, purely because that's the way the world was. Perhaps it's best illustrated if I read a poem from the book Disembodied, how embodiment was fractured and became disembodied. And of course, very appropriately, this particular poem is located in Delhi, which is the city I'm in right now and where I live for, I used to say part of the year because London was home as well, but now Delhi. The Delhi could be any part of the world which is going through similar situation. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from aurora borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs, fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe, where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worship, not for its blessing, but its contour, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains. Skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark, No GPS, no Polestar navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass.
A sharp, unflinching commentary. I think we all see, but sometimes it's very helpful when someone sees with a different sort of rose-lensed glasses. So to come back to this idea of silence,
Yes.
and how that in itself is a world, and that's something you've really written about and thought about. How does that sit within the silence, which is obviously outer and inner, and then the opposite of that, which can be some sort of a reaction, which is also can be outer and inner? How does that really come about in your work?
Well, silence has been a very, very core aspect of my writing. Both as a person, I long for spaces of silence. So, for the longest time, I've grown up in a big city, New Delhi being one, and then I've lived in New York and London and Dhaka. These are the four big cities I've largely grown up and worked in. And these are cities that are teeming with noise and sound and cacophony. And how does one find silence? Because even families there never used to be sort of private rooms until much later when, people became wealthier and you had your private room. Otherwise, everything was very communal for the longest time. So my favorite place was a graveyard. Every city I used to seek out graveyards. Because when you're in a graveyard, I'm peopled by so many souls and personalities and history that is buried. Yet there's a beautiful silence there, and nobody's talking to you, and I can converse with everyone. So it's a wonderful space to be. I know a lot of my friends think that it's a very morbid kind of a preoccupation, loving graveyards. But really, when you think about it, especially old, raw graveyards, and you'll see plenty of them in England. And if it's a good, beautiful day, when the evening sun slants across these tombstones that are half broken, and the pregnant silence that pervades there is just magical. I mean, actually, these are wonderful places, not of grief, but of life that is to be joyous about. So silence, yes. So it's a very internal core, of course, but I also make space for it, because without silence, you can't think, you can't write, you can't be proactive, productive. And it's my source of meditation. So poetry and silence is what I try and live with as metaphors.
Would you read us Silence? This is one of my favorite poems that you.
Yeah, you did mention. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, it's become a lot of people's favorite, actually. Recently, last year, this poem became the centerpiece for a film, which is eponymously called Silence itself. It was made by Ramandeep Kaur, and it's a beautiful poetic film with a triptych of poems, and this was at the center of it. Silence. Silence has its own subtle color. Between each breath pause, heat simmers, latent saliva, tongue entwined lisp. Here and there, errant clouds wait, yearning for new rain. Desire melting, even silence to words. Words bleed color, incarnadine, as your lips whisper softly the secrets of your silence. Your fine chicken blouse, white, sheer, and almost transparent, cannot hide the quiet of your heartbeat on your deep olive skin. The milk white flower adorning your hair sheds a solitary petal, just one. In that petal, silence blooms color, white, transparent white, pure white silence.
Incredibly beautiful.
Thank
It
you.
gains in its elegance with each reading. And it reminds me of another that you wrote called Implosion.
Oh, yeah, that's the other side of silence, but it is silence in a very different kind of way. Yes.
Yeah. And but perhaps we can hear it and see the stark difference, really.
Yes, Implosion is very, very new. I wrote it during the lockdown, actually. Yes, it's a prose poem, and here it goes. Implosion. It's on page 729 of Anthropocene. A storm is raging inside my ribcage, electric sparks short-circuiting my bronchial tubes. It feels as if my lungs are imploding onto themselves with a severe lack of oxygen supply. Constant high-frequency whistling sounds or wheezing pierce my eardrum. I cannot sleep through this night's cacophonic cyclone, even though all appears calm and still. On my bedside table, even the electric bulb under the lamp's hood cannot hold its wattage steady, with all the fluctuations inside me, mirroring only mildly the tsunami inside. I need to call an ambulance, but I hesitate. More eucalyptus steam inhalation, Ventolin sprays, mixed concoction of ginger, black pepper, turmeric, and organic honey provide only a temporary respite. A looped orchestral score of unbalanced, shrill echoes inside my chest, making Stravinsky's Rites of Spring sound melodious. I cannot breathe. I desperately need air.
That sums up millions and millions of people's direct and rather painful experience in just a few words. And if we think about how many millions of words have been probably written in the last 15 months, it's no slight achievement to distill it into something as powerful, as quietly powerful as Implosion.
Thank you.
It really is something that needs to be thought about and mulled over in people's own privacy and inner thoughts. Reading your various poems, and sometimes I like to call them compositions actually, because they are almost like an embodiment of movement. And because I'm a classical dancer, it's something that automatically speaks to me. And I think anybody who has a love of movement, has a love of dance, and reads, more than a few of your poems will realize that you too have this incredible appreciation and innate link to movement. So this really brings me to my sort of next question for you. And it's about a sense of boundaries. So, and I'm glad that I'm not the only one who really likes this aspect of your work. I'm drawn to a few words written by Fiona Sampson. It's in the foreword of Fractals, which I've now read multiple times, and I probably will carry on reading. So I'm going to read out a few things that Fiona Fiona has found in your work, and I completely agree. He's exceptionally interested in boundaries. These poems are alive to their possibilities and preoccupied with the delicacy of proximity. Often, the boundary is human skin. Sometimes, the boundary that is or is not quite crossed is the space between ink and the white page. Sometimes, whether or not it goes by way of images of paper and skin, the boundary is perception itself. Sen's poetic persona encourages us, as he encourages himself, to go forwards and with extreme care and delicacy, to encounter something beyond ourselves and what we know. And I thoroughly agree. And so it's really about this idea of what it is to be in your skin and how you envisage being in another skin, and this feeling of being in and being out. And there's a choreography, there's a design to this being in and being out, and this movement, and whether you're actually witnessing it or whether you're in the movement yourself. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and some of the compositions that have really, really attracted my attention include Mohiniyattam, Bharatanatyam dancer, and a couple of others, but I'll let you expand because this is one of my favorite things about your work.
See, the wonderful thing about it, having different sorts of interviewers, they bring their own areas of interest and expertise. And you, of course, are particularly sort of interesting in the sense that your kind of triumvirate is most unusual. Lawyer by day, and a classical dancer, and a poet. My gosh, but yeah, you're sensible. You chose law, and you go to Canary Wharf every day. But yes, I'm glad you called them composition because, for me, as I was telling you earlier, that poetry is the core of all classical arts. When you think of dance, the songs you dance to, the classical songs you dance to, are basically classical poets that are sung aloud. Sorry. So the element of composition, not just metrically within the text, is important, but spatially it's important too. So how it shows up on the page is terribly, terribly important. As Fiona was talking about, and I keep saying this, that the white space on a page is equally important and crucial and vital as the inked part of the page. It's sort of almost like a point and counterpoint, yin and yang, in a sense. Talking about compositions, like for instance, the poem Bharatanatyam Dancer, I've invented a new form in English poetry. The rhyme scheme is A, B, X, B, A, B, X, B, A. And sorry, the Bharatanatyam dancer is Tadhin Tatai Thaita, Tadhin Tatai Thaita. So it replicates that one. And the end lines, the end stop lines actually mirror those rhyme schemes, something that has not been done in English poetry. So as an Indian writer, it's actually quite fun to draw from all the rich sources we have and then make English language anew, not just at the level of proficiency and writing about spaces which, say, non-Indian writers cannot write about, but in fact contributing to the very heart and core of English poetry, which is grammar, metrics, and verse form. So this wasn't there before. Similarly, in New York Times, the poem, each stanza looks like the island of Manhattan. And if you turn the book 90 degrees and use the middle of the page as the mirror line, then the shape of the island also mimics the tall buildings and its reflection on the water. And that's where I was saying that the rhyme scheme is A, B, X, B, A. So the X line, the middle line, is the mirror line, reflecting the first two and fourth and fifth. So there's lots of instances like this where at least 4 or 5 different times I've actually introduced completely new metrical forms. Agha Shahid Ali, the wonderful poet from Kashmir who lived in America for many years, reintroduced ghazal, the form ghazal in English in America, and then the American ghazal became a big thing, and people were writing ghazals in English. So yes, all these are very important, and it's also at a personal level a lot of fun, because you also want to create and do things that are sort of like puzzles, and you unwrap them. Initially, of course, the Bharatanatyam dance poem didn't arrive at that sort of wonderful sort of shape and metrics. It was only later when I was thinking about the rag and the bol and the tal, ta dhin ta tai tai ta, ta dhin ta tai tai ta. I said, why not sonically create that rhyme scheme? So that's really how it happens. So yeah, composition both vertically, horizontally, and also using the x-axis, which is the depth of the stage. I use all that in 3D on a flat page with my poetry. Yes.
Yeah. Which is such a pleasure to see for any dance lover, not just a dancer, but any dance lover. So we have a great...
Actually, talking about dance, my next book, the current book I'm working on, is called The Whispering Anklet. That's entirely based on classical Indian dance and some music. And some Western ballet too, but largely 90% of it is classical Indian dance.
Yes.
The Payal, The Whispering Anklet. So the two poems, Mohiniyattam and Bharatanatyam Dancer, you talked about, these are older poems, which will also go into that book because it just fits in so well. But there are many others. Maybe I should read one of the dance poems.
Absolutely, it would be wonderful. I mean, there's Mohiniyattam, Odissi, Kathak, Bharatanatyam Dancer. Yeah, the choice is yours.
Let me read one of the new ones, because the Mohiniyattam and both Mohiniyattam and Bharatanatyam I've read before many times, but Kathak is a relatively new poem. It's dedicated to a friend of mine who I think is just the most outstanding contemporary dancer. Her name is Aditi Mangaldas, who you may have seen, and not just when she does pure classical Kathak, but she's really pushed the boundaries of Kathak and modern dance, and any of her productions, you should see, is just stunning. But this was inspired by a more classical show, Kathak, for Aditi Mangaldas. Deep within the eyes of a dancer, irises and poems bloom. On her cupped, curled, coal-lined eyelids, similes smile. On each eyelash, metaphors arch, waiting to flutter. On her bosom's electric silk fabric, secret lyrics are bloused. Her limbs' slender extension tips decant arias. Tumris sing, soar, her balletic grace liquid. She dances on water, always afloat. Even Khusro and Kabir, stunned, tongue-tied, searchingly compete to compose couplets for this dancer's next movement. Pupils wide-eyed, she cajoles, seeking her lover. Hidden in the dancer's heart, the beloved quietly resides. Yes,
incredible.
One of the many.
Incredible. I mean, I was talking earlier about these different aspects of your creative expression, and movement is a large part of it. And so is light, and this connection to photography that you have. And we can see that. We can simply see that in the cover of Anthropocene, which is obviously designed by you. And it's a beautiful cover. How does the photography feed into the word art? Because the way you write and how the poems look on the page, it's art. So how do the two become best friends?
They are not just best friends, they are sort of married in a way, and they're sort of also act as sort of coy mistresses. Um, Not alluding to the metaphysical poets, of course, John Donne and so on. But they are very much part of each other. Light is, of course, the essential tool for photography. Photography is nothing but play of light. How much light you expose, how much light you let in through the aperture, what the contrast ratios are like, what the saturation points are. It's actually only a play of light. Words too are weighed by light and texture and sound, as is dance and music. So for me, they're all constantly interlinked. The visual, the tactility of writing, the sort of fantasy of imagination, and the fact of nonfiction. They're all always interlinked. So if I'm just doing a poem, of course, on the face of it, it is a poem, but I'm glad you see it as also art, because also a book is an object of art. It's really sad that book production, in many ways, people have gone to, just basic digital paperback. And I understand why, because they're cheaper to produce and so on. But it's such a pleasure, for instance, that this particular book, the publisher just, whatever I asked for, he said yes to. Hardback, cloth bound. In the old days, the inside cloth, if you look at it, you will have gold or silver foiling inside with the title and the author's name and so on. And why was that so? Because the dust jacket, which has now become the premier cloth we wear, the models wear to show off their wares, actually was not really important. It was simply a dust jacket, because every book was a hardback. They were in libraries. The dust jacket basically tore. That's why on the last 2 pages, the bio of the author is always printed and repeated on the dust jacket, because the dust jacket actually eventually goes. So the embossing and the cloth bond remains. And in low light, you can actually see if you go to old libraries where the stacks are really high and deep, all you need to do is shine a torch and you can see it glint. You can see the title very clearly. Otherwise, you have to climb up the ladder. So there are reasons as to why all this. So it's just bringing back the whole idea of the art of beautiful bookmaking is also so terribly important, because tactility is lost. Because people are, scared of touching each other. There's all these fake boundaries which we have to create, sadly, because as human beings, as I'm sure as children, we would just, you're a Bengali and all Indians, we are so used to growing up in families that are so overly tactile that I had to retrain myself when I was in the West not to touch people, because it's just not on. So yes, light, tactility, texture, cadence, all that actually feeds into poetry. Not just poetry, but it's a holistic thing. So it's very, very important.
Yeah,
it's very important, all these things. A poem, depending on what light I'm reading it under, changes mood. If it's low light and I'm reading the same poem, it evokes a particular kind of mood. If it's harsh light, it evokes a particular kind of mood. Because again, this particular book has been printed on what is called unbleached paper, natural shade paper. So it absorbs light like a natural tree pulp would. But modern technology and the nouveau publishers or writers would want white bleached page because it's just crisper and sharper. But actually you're losing such the rust and the lay of the page itself, I mean, imagine, when I write poetry, I always use a pencil. I mean, computer is, of course, something I use all the time, but it's just a glorified typewriter. But, when I use my grandfather's fountain pen ink on handmade paper, just the wonderful scratchy noise it makes. It's just like drinking beautiful single malt. It's just, or listening to classical music. It's just so fabulously ethereal. I can go on and on, as you can tell.
Yeah. I mean, the palpable pleasure and the romance of what it is to open a brand new hardback book, particularly cloth bound. I mean, that definitely is something that always is quite high on my list of priorities. Books in any case are a great love, and when you have spent the time and the love in creating a new piece, I can't imagine anyone waiting too long before they can actually dig into it. And just the smell of it, I mean, the whole thing, everything, waiting for it to arrive. It arrives, you open it, the smell of it, the touch of it.
When you think about, musicians, most music big bands, produce their own albums. They don't rely on publishers. They design their own albums. Each particular album and logo has a very distinctive flavor. So a Pink Floyd album, you can tell from very far that it's Pink Floyd, or a Beatles album. They're very distinct. Only very strangely in the world of publishing, there's this sort of fakery that you cannot do it yourself, because that's not the way the industry works. Yeah. All musician friends of mine produce their own record. They only use a distributor to distribute their their records or tapes or CDs, and it's open, secret. That's their job. That's all they do. But so it's not.
I completely agree.
It's just wonderful to bring back the centeredness of a hardback on good paper. Yeah. Prabhu, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. When you were speaking about your love of photography and just understanding how these two worlds mold together, really, I automatically thought of prayer flags. Yes. A really, really gorgeous piece. It would be wonderful to hear you recite prayer flags, and then there's a real treat, even a bigger treat, awaiting us, which is a short film. And perhaps after prayer flags, if you could give us a quick introduction to the short film, we can move directly into that. And I mean, both are going to be absolutely amazing.
So rather than reading prayer flag and repeating the same poem twice, let the film actually be played. But before the film is played, let me just say that the poem Prayer Flag was used by another dancer I admire immensely. This is one of the doyens of Indian dance, Shobna Narayan. So she was doing this one. You must see this production. It's called Shunyata. And she used Prayer Flag as the prologue to her production. And on the stage, there were 50 monks, live 50 monks chanting Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani, the sort of baritonic echo, and again, use of stylized lighting, and you could just see their silhouettes in their red robes. So this poem was actually used as an intro to her production. And of course, I jokingly used to say that, great, now that the production is happening, I'm going to go with you, because I have to read the poem out everywhere you perform, all over the world. She says, that might be difficult. So then the film version was made, which is, when she's going with a reduced cast, maybe 2 monks and not 50 monks, or maybe 2 of her dancers dress up as monks when she's traveling abroad. The Russian opens on the backdrop with the film, and she's there, So that's the film. That's how the film happened, and it's just the director also did a beautiful, beautiful job. So yeah, it's Shobna Narayan who's doing Abhinay purely in this film, and Aparna Sannayal did a fabulous job making this film. So let's probably see the film right now.
Om Tadam Shvam Shau Varaniyo Jyotish Kumbhasya Dhimahi Krutam Bhavyam Hi Bhavaya Om Gayatri Divyai Namaha Om
Mani Padme Hum. Oh, the jewel in the lotus. 1. Manas Sarovar, Mount Kailash. Frayed, flapping in the high winds, prayer flags gently unravel. Homage to the day's first light. But today the dawn is not as bright, though heavy, brooding, silver grey like the lake's shimmering glass top. No one is here except for a woman staring far away, wrapped in her sanctity of continuous linen, her own sari like a prayer flag, though devoid of any color. She isn't mourning or crying, just gazing fixedly into the water's changing glimmer as the sky's wet weight and the shore's rocky line meet, their edges meanderingly melting into the lake itself. I stood far behind her, behind everything she saw. She was only an accidental figure in the widescreen frame. Unlike her, I was looking skywards through the prayer flag's translucent cotton, counting each thread of each piece of cloth that wove private stories whispered only to me. Weather-worn, strung across canted multiple horizons, I tried to map their own geographies, each an island, each with its own terrain, texture, inscription, and scripture. Found on the highest points on land, as close to the sky as is possible, these magic carpets, shapes caught on an unintentional clothesline, were more meaningful to me than this vast monastic scenery. How each flag, each one must have preserved secrets that only their owners knew. How each a talisman exuded safety and calm, shrouding away grief for the briefest while when one forgets everything, real, imagined, and just dreams. My own piece of cloth that I once tied onto this line wasn't visible to me now. But that did not matter. I found strength in this procession of private passion, in these flags' lack of starch or hierarchy. Their stories passed down by one flag to another, toggled hand in hand through time and age, just like my pet yellow butterfly who infused each flower in my garden with the gift of life without any show or fair. I like the transparent quiet here. I also like the wind's occasional sound, its severe current tearing through the flag's heart, picking out the perfect pitch and melody. A memory now, a still, framed, not revealing to the world what I had once seen. The panorama's generosity, its wild, stark untouchability, how each story stitched and preserved like the jewel in the lotus, its crystal fine edges caressed by petal soft skin, until everything folds inward like a fetus in a womb, a toppled, misplaced comma, my own implanted memory. And then they bloom, fanning outward, each flag, strand, story, each private grief and pleasure, chanting noiselessly in the mountains' silent winds.
Breathtaking.
Yeah, sometimes I don't even think how I wrote this poem. When I was looking at it, it just didn't even feel that I wrote it. But there we are. Poetry is both intimate and transcendental, and once it's out there, it doesn't belong to you anymore. Which is why I tell younger writers that the better beat it up and craft it really well, because we won't be out there protecting the little baby that actually I meant it this way. But if anything is well crafted and it's got a transcendental quality about it, it'll fly, it'll float. And especially I find it particularly warming when people who are not poets, not literary people, technically, professionally, who respond to my work with such intellect and with such heart and with such warmth that they want to do something with it. So that's a real treat. That's when you think that it's all worth it, even at a private level.
Absolutely. It's highly satisfying as an artist and just on a human level. It's I mean, I could talk about dance and your poetry for hours on end, but I'm sure our listeners and viewers would want to have a chance to taste the other flavors of your work. So I come to this idea of personal method and experience, particularly this fantasy element. So this is something that I call a superpower. And when a writer has this superpower, it makes everything possible for them. And it's this ability to travel through fantasy, to change age through fantasy, to be this eternal student. So, of course, that then takes me to the question, before you're writing or taking photographs, what's happening? What's happening in the sort of physicality of it and in the mental space? And this question came to me because I was reading Skyscapes, which is part of your lockdown diaries, and also Language, and they jump off the page and they take the reader with them, and so something has to happen in order for that reaction to happen. So my question is, before you're even getting the idea, what is happening to you?
Oh my, it's just such a pleasure to sort of hear a question that comes from inside rather than the outside. I can almost see that you're asking this question as a practicing dancer. Sometimes, to tell you really honestly, I don't know. I can be very glib and erudite and give you a very, very plausible answer, which will be very impressive. But often, to tell you really honestly, I have no idea. But what I do know is I'm deeply immersed in that moment or that space, to the point that I'm maybe even with a lot of people, but I'm detached. So for instance, if I'm in a prayer hall, I'm a secular person. I don't necessarily believe in God, but I do believe in a higher power, faith. You can see it. A lot of my poetry is very spiritually rooted as well. But I'm just equally happy in a mosque or in a mandir or in a church. That's the way I grew up. I started my day with the Lord's Prayer. I went to St. Columba's School. I spoke Bangla at home and Hindi on the street. That's how we all grew up. So it's what happens before, all the years before any act of creation, what happens before sort of culminates to you leaping off. And you're taking the reader, the audience, they have to have a leap of faith too, along with you. And you have to also tell yourself, it's okay if you fail. It's okay if you make a mistake. Because if we were flawless, we would be the God herself. We are all mortal human beings. And mortal human beings have flaws. And it's the flaws in us and the willingness to improve or correct those flaws that make us special and palatable and acceptable. So, what happens before a process? All of this happens unconsciously. But some lightning jolt will happen. And of course, we are in a very modern space. And how do I sort of excuse myself, say, from a cocktail party when something completely obscure has struck me so deeply that I have to go and write about it? So I would just go to the bathroom or something and take a tissue and just write down my thought and just keep it to myself so that I don't lose it. Or at night, if it's winter's night and you're under the duvet and something strikes you, you have to trek across the cold floor to your study and put the thought down. And there have been moments where, I haven't done it. I said, I'll do it tomorrow morning. I'll remember it. And it's gone. It's flown away. It doesn't make for a great situation with your partner who doesn't want to leave you. So you don't want to abandon the person, every other day because you've got this thing to do. But that's the nature of, things that, it's both intimate at the same time detached. So a lot happens before, but the moment of inspiration is the sort of major spark. And then after that, all the notes you have, you sort of assemble them together and there's a sort of flow. And the longer you do it, the easier it gets. It's like improvising with dance. If you have the basic grammar or movement straight, then you can, compose differently, quickly or slowly, however you want. I mean, when Azharuddin in the cricket field, plays a leg glance, it's just effortlessly beautiful. I mean, he just does it to the best bowlers in the world. You think, how is it possible? Because he spent a lot of years in the nets just doing just that one thing. So that's what I do with poetry. 2 hours every day I would sit with poetry. It's riyaz. It's just nothing but riyaz. And it's not as though I can write a new poem every day. I'll be very, very thrilled if I can, but of course I can't. So if I can't, then I'll read someone else's book of poetry, I'll edit, I will review someone else's. It's my way of praying to the poetry god, staying with poetry. And then after that is what you're talking about, the poem itself or the photograph you've taken and what happens. But you've taken the photograph, but even after taking the photograph, there are so many different frames. You still have to look at it again and recreate that multiple framed mood in one frame. How do you do that? Because the photograph, that's just one shutter you're going to present. But I've taken many, the sun's moved, the light is moved. How do you try and best get that in one frame? So that's where all the other calibration, grammar, and photography come in. Whether you want to raise the tonality a bit or just touch the contrast. Do you want to crop it this way? Does it have to be a 4:3 aspect ratio or a 16:9 aspect ratio? Because that also determines how the viewer looks at the scenography. Because if it's landscape and if it's a panoramic, that has a particular effect. If it's close up, so that's the process of actually just sitting down and with the chisel and you're doing the work. Yeah. And at some point you let it fly. And in this case, when it's out in the book, and someone else has bought the book, the poem doesn't belong to me anymore, much that I would like it to be. Someone's bought it. It's a transaction. Someone has forked out 20 quid and bought the book. It's theirs to tear it, to appreciate it, to throw it away. And I'm not there to explain any of this. So I want it to be in a stage, ideally, where it makes sense to the reader and hopefully touches the reader and is meanembodied.
Yeah, I think language is a very good example of that. It would be great to hear. Yeah, it's an embodiment of exactly the things that you've been mentioning just now.
So language, this is one of the poems in Anthropocene. And again, I just realized maybe I'm just way too old-fashioned, What am I writing? The poem itself is about an old, rickety manual typewriter. And the romance I had with those lovely silk ribbons, the red and black silk ribbons which you put in the spool. And of course, now it's so difficult to get hold of them. Anyway, it's about creation, it's about puja, it's about communication, it's about love, it's about empathy, and it's about creation, actually. It opens with an epigraph from Italo Calvino. The title is, of course, Language, and I quote the epigraph. Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally. My typewriter is multilingual, its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar forked tongue. Black red silk ribbons, spools, unwind as the carriage moves right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another. The translation seamless. Auricles, ventricles pump blood, corpuscle-like alphabets, phrases, syntax, cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence, spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language.
Yeah. It's one of my favorites. That's why I really wanted to hear you read it. There's something that comes up again and again, actually. It's this, and you mentioned it, with the typewriter and the romance of it. There is a real sense of history in your work and a celebration of civilization from the granular to the macro. And there's a sort of generosity about it. There's a rich, almost sort of double chocolate cake feeling about this celebration of, all the beautiful things that have been created and now are there as a legacy for us to enjoy. And there's a few that have popped up in this beautiful group that I like to call the sense of history and place. And maybe because I also love traveling, and we're not allowed to travel at the moment, so it has even more importance. So poems like Alexandria, which is obviously Egypt based, and then Dancing Ground, which is very highly influenced by New Mexico, and then The Gift of Light, which is linked to Humayun's tomb. So there's this, these are ancient cultures and or classical cultures, and there's this incredible sense of history and joy meeting together. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and perhaps pick your favorite, and perhaps we can hear some of this double chocolate cake feeling that I love?
Well, I don't know about the double chocolate bit. It's equally about joyousness and celebration as much as it's about grief and deprivation. The yin and yang exists all the time. But the important thing is, you brought it up, light. Without light, it'll be eternal darkness, and we cannot survive in darkness. So light is oxygen, light is love, light is empathy, light is humanity. So a large part of my focus, living and writing, is worshipping light itself, in whichever form it is. So the Humayun's tomb, Gift of Life, I was looking at the tombstones in Humayun's tomb, and the way light was playing on the architecture there. There was nothing deathly about it. It was only beautiful and poetic. Though the reason it is so is because millennia of history and kings and queens and so on have passed through that, leaving their imprints and what we have gained from them. So there's a sense of richness. I think that's what you're referring to. There's a lot there to unpack. And one of the things, when I was a young writer, and one of my mentors taught me is that make sure the language is clean, distilled, and elegant. And it doesn't have to be dense and complicated, but let the thoughts be complex. So as a young writer, I remember, I used to write poetry, which was like, very few people could understand except for me and maybe a friend of mine, who we were having the conversation with. But it's only through maturity that you realize that, you can actually distill these things, because there's more in less, actually. So out of the three you just mentioned, maybe I should just read the one in Anthropocene, because that's the newest book. And it's called The Gift of Light. And it ties in, photography, light, talking about dance, lighting, talking about the light that illuminates our soul, and literature. And I, not unsurprisingly, quote as an epigraph Stanley Kubrick, the filmmaker. And I quote, "However vast the darkness, we must supply our own light." And it's so true for this day and age. Through filigreed jolly screens of pink ochre sandstone, light melts into darkness in the sanctum sanctorum. Emperor Humayun lies entombed in marble. In this dusk penumbra, another laser-sharp beam cross-cuts the axis of the light's path. Its precise angular shaft, a dream, an illusion, its gradations subtly aligned, its frequency pitch perfect. Our own quiet breathing, a silent sacred song, softly muted, unlike the azan's piercing prayer call. The gift of light is life's benediction in these dark times. No matter what or where, there's always light.
Very apt. It brings this beauty in within the light and hope, and actually it's wonderful that you did read something from Anthropocene, because that's something that is there in abundance. You're dealing with dark, heavy, very tough subjects which we are having to live through, and yet there is this celebration in it. There is this joy and this love and this sense of light and hope which is interspersed throughout the work. Particularly a couple that immediately come to mind is Love in the Time of Corona, simply because it's I can see great things happening with this composition. I think this has got a complete life of its own, even outside of Anthropocene. And then, of course, the very beautiful That Is. Perhaps you could talk about those two. I think fittingly they'll be, among our final readings from Anthropocene, and it'll be great to really hear about how the pandemic and the hope do belong together.
I ultimately, when I was finishing up the book, and I was thinking, finally, if I were to have this book out as a book, why am I doing it? Of course, there's a personal reason why I'm doing it, because I'm writing it. There's a creative process, and and want the work to be out there. But think of every time there's grief or time of difficulty, people place things in your palm, like a talisman. It could be an oval stone. It could be a red thread with a mantra in it. If you go to a church, it could be just the Bible or the crucifix. The wonderful thing is I feel comfortable with all of this anytime. Each one is the same, really. All gods are same, depending on what you... So I want this book to be a book of hope. Really, that's why the whole section on consolation, because that's what we want to, go away with. Yes, I described the horrors and so on and so forth, but again, that is in a particular context, and it's in, the pandemic is a very small part of a wider context of Anthropocene, which is climate change. And if we people don't get our act together, our children are already suffering. We are suffering. Bad air, water, destruction of everything, So really, so the whole idea of hope and consolation is, it was very important for me to be always there somewhere, hovering, either as a backdrop or as an antithesis or as an echo. Because if you don't have those echoes, you can't move forward, which is why I end at the book ending. There's a quote from one of my favorite poets, Czeslaw Milosz. And it's very important for me to use that as the bookend. And I just read these 3 lines, which ends the book, not my lines. So that's really what it's all about. And he writes, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all that a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow." Yes. So I read That Is, maybe.
That's good.
Because I have to be watchful of the time as well. I read That Is and then end with Banyan, which is, again, a tree of wisdom, a tree of shelter. And I talk about Banyan in a bit once we finish. That is a poem which is very, very structurally unlike anything else I've written. It's just a few gold dust or stardust that has been sprinkled on the sand, and how it sort of aggregates themselves together in this sort of ephemeral way. And the book, in fact, was launched on my son's birthday, 21st of May. And the poem is dedicated to him, who's right now, if he's a good boy, he's listening from Leicester. If not, he said, "Oh, Dad, one more poetry reading." But it's, initially he said, "I have no idea what it's about, but I love it." And he's a very, very sensitive reader. And a lot of people have said, he said, "We love this poem, but what is really happening?" Let's see what happens. That is, and the title is I.E. That is. That is because you hear the sound of the lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. I think I didn't write it. I think it was dictated by the gods. It was really dictated by the gods. It's not something I can write so easily. At the same time, it was written fairly easily. And then, yes, magic. Somewhere there's magic.
It's ethereal. It's sort of misty and gold dusty and nebulous, but yet you can feel it. It's incredible. It's really, really beautiful, and I can see why you choose that to share with us. I'm really glad that you did.
Thank you.
We come to the final part. It's gone so quickly. I mean, there was so much to discuss and share, and hopefully we've really whetted the appetite of our listeners and supporters, and they can now, continue the journey by themselves or with friends if they're part of book clubs, which is now very popular these days, book clubs. But I come to sort of lyric, song, and collaboration finale section, really, and exploring the idea of lyric and all your collaborations with various writers, artists, filmmakers, musicians, playwrights, directors. I mean, just to give an example, Michael Walling of Border Crossing UK produced your poetry as stage plays. One was actually at the Nehru Centre itself. BBC radio play of Vesuvius, bands like Sid Peacock in Ireland and Advaita in New Delhi, Aditya Balani in New Delhi, and Hyderabad Jazz Collective. I mean, it's wonderful to see this celebration of your work and your visualizations spreading, and not just spreading through one medium, but many mediums. That's wonderful to see. But there is one particular work that has to be mentioned, which you alluded to earlier, Banyan. Could you tell us a little bit about Banyan? And this will be the finale piece for today. So we're looking forward to it.
Yes, and Banyan has been a late inclusion in this program because something wonderful happened. I was on a Zoom event not that long ago, maybe a couple of months ago, and one of the listeners, Heather Ann Shepherd, she's a poet and a singer and a songwriter, and she and her husband have produced many albums. Mark Shepherd, who's also the sound engineer and mixer. I didn't know all that. So she was, part of the thing, part of that program, and then we communicated on this wonderful thing called the little chat on Facebook Messenger, and got to know that she's there was some sort of a connect, and she has just produced this beautiful song called Banyan, which was just finished. I was told the final mixing was just finished a day ago. She said, sitting in Oregon or wherever she is, I forget, they're in the house. So hello, Heather and Marcus. You'll see your song being played. It's the sort of premiere, in a sense, of the song. So that's how it happened. But the Banyan poem itself goes back a long way. As a child, I used to play hide and seek, because they were wonderful spaces to sort of, it's just a magical thing. It's a world on its own. You're in the sort of hive within hides. So let me read out the poem, and then we'll play Heather's and Mark's song version before we end the program. Banyan. As winter secrets melt with the purple sun, what is revealed is electric. Notes tune unknown scales, syntax alters tongues, terracotta melts white, banyan ribbons into armatures as branch roots twist, meeting soil in a circle. Circuits glazed under cloth carry alphabets for a calligrapher's nib, italicized in invisible ink, letters never posted, cartographer's map uncharted. As phrases fold, so do veils. And now it's a great privilege to premiere Heather Ann Shepherd's song, the same eponymous title, and Marcus, who's behind the song. Let's enjoy that.
As winter secrets melt with the purple sun, what is revealed is electric. kneading soil in a circle, circuits glazed under cloth, carry alphabets for a calligrapher's near. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. Italicized in invisible ink, letters never posted, photographer's map, uncharted, as phrases fall, so do veils, as phrases fall, so do veils. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric.
Soulful, pure and soulful.
Yes, thank you, Heather and Marcus. What a wonderful gift. What a wonderful track. Thank you.
Absolutely, it was a real treat.
To many more.
Oh yes, I think it is, without a shadow of a doubt, a great deal more will come out of Anthropocene. It is a source of inspiration, and there is shared pain, and there is shared grief and shared joy, all bound up in this incredibly beautiful new book that you have dedicated, the best part of a whole year. And the fact that you, when you went through that process, probably didn't have in mind that this would happen today, but here we are, and we've come to this this end point or midpoint of a journey together, which is really, really beautiful. It raises incredibly important questions of our social responsibility, individual responsibility, how we want to live our lives in the long term. I mean, these things are something that we are aware of on a daily basis, but to be aware of it through such beauty, precision, clarity, and at the same time magic, that doesn't happen every day. So yes, this piece quite rightly stands as a first of its type. I wish you great success with it, and I can see no other future for it. It is and it will be a great success. And I thank you and Prabhuji, and I hand over to Prabhuji now for the final vote of thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Indraniji, for your kind interview and sort of emceeing the whole thing. Lovely. And thank you again, Sudeep, for your wonderful poetry, and of course for your performance today, as it were. I mean, it's a bit of a performance. And I thought I might just read a very short poem of yours as a way of concluding, but also thanking you. And this is your poem, Ash Smoke. It's a haiku, so it's 3 lines, and it goes like this. Something still remains. Otherwise, from ashes, smoke would not rise again. So that's a beautiful haiku and a very moving one. And I think that's true of the best of your poetry. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, the Nehru Centre. Thank you, the Indian High Commission, the publisher, Indrani. You did a sterling job just sort of navigating through all the intricacies of the poetry. Heather and Marcus, and so many people I can see.
And Amish as well. Thank you very much, Amish, for organizing and.
Yes, he's a wonderful writer. So the sensitive soul comes through, and the people. My gosh, the comments I can see flashing. It's lovely. Thank you very, very much. Good night.
Thank you, both of you. Bye for
Stay
now.
safe.
Bye.
Thank you.